Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation in Newport is the foundational document for the American Jewish experience, but also because of its language, it is a foundation for religious liberty for the entire nation. The first thing in terms of the Jews is that it borrowed language that was written by Moses Seixas when he welcomed Washington on his visit to Newport in August of 1790. And it uses language that Seixas said to Washington in his address. Seixas said that this was a country which to bigotry gives no sanction, to persecution no assistance. Given Jewish history, a history where they had faced bigotry, where they had faced persecution across the millennia, this was an astonishing announcement about what America meant for the Jews. But it was also a document that, surprisingly, Washington started to talk about that this is no more by toleration that we speak of the privileges that we are giving to Jews. It's actually a right. And as newspapers around the country printed that letter, as thousands, if not tens of thousands of books have reprinted some of those words, that really stands out as striking. That at a moment when the Jews in Europe are just beginning to win emancipation that's based on the notion, okay, we're going to tolerate you and give you equal rights. In America, there's no concept like that. The Jews have those rights from the get-go. Anti-Semitism emerges in the United States from the very moment, the very second that the Jews landed in New Amsterdam in 1654. And when Peter Stuyvesant tried to eject what he called this deceitful race, these hateful enemies and blasphemers of Christ, and anti-Semitism is a factor of American Jewish life. It has always been there. Sometimes it surfaces more heavily, sometimes less so. But Jews have learned across their experience that to be a Jew means to live with anti-Semitism. So it comes in all sorts of different forms. Most often before the Civil War, it came in the form of hateful rhetoric. A neighbor calls a Jewish woman, she literally calls her a Jewish bitch. It also comes in statements about Jews being the descendants of those who murdered Jesus. But sometimes anti-Semitism also comes in the form of life-changing alterations. I think of Mordecai Manuel Noah, who had been appointed U.S. consul to Tunis. And when he was recalled, and the language of the letters said that his religion was an obstacle to his being a consul in Tunis. Now, the reality is he also wasn't listening to what Washington told him to do. So it was probably a pretext, but it changed the course of his life, that recall. So anti-Semitism is definitely present in the United States in these years. Another place where you really see it is in the evolution of the McGuffey readers. The first McGuffey readers are published in the second half of the 1830s. By 1870, they would sell something like 47 million copies of McGuffey readers. Those were the graded readers boys and girls used in school. They started in grade 1 and it moved all the way up to probably grade 6. And McGuffey readers are filled with statements about Christian triumphalism and about how the Jews murdered Jesus. So it's everywhere in the United States before the Civil War. Grant's General Orders number 11, expelling the Jews as a class from Grant's military district, affected the Jews immediately, some because they were literally expelled. Actually, the number was so small, it's really subsequently surprising. But the number of Jews who reacted to that really stands out. So we have Caesar Cascal, who just hears the order on his own in Paducah, and he sets off for Washington. He's going to make sure that the government overturns this egregious error. We have the organization of B'nai B'rith, the first Jewish organization outside of a synagogue, and they sign a document and they send that to Washington as a protest. So we have lots of individual Jews who are finding out about this order. Remember, it's military times. We don't have the internet. People don't get their information right away. But those who find out about it protest immediately because it is an outrage to expel the Jews as a class. It evokes for American Jews the expulsions of Jews from England and France and Spain. It evokes for them the laws that they were subject to as a class, laws that decided where they could live in ghettos, what kinds of jobs they could do. They could sell old clothes, they could be money lenders, but to treat all Jews in the United States as a class was a shock to American Jews. It was treated as an affirmation that America has upheld the values of religious liberty. And remember, it's Lincoln who rescinds the order. He tells General Halleck, and Halleck writes to Grant. And this was, I'd say this is another foundational moment in in guaranteeing the place of American Jews as members of this nation. I don't know that we actually know how Grant reacted then to having the order rescinded. We do know that it clearly haunted him subsequently. It became a factor, certainly for Jews, in the 1868 election. It became a factor in the 1872 election, where the Democrats tried to use it to derail his campaign. And we know that Grant subsequently, while he never formally apologized, he never mentioned it in his memoirs, but he made amends by appointing strikingly large numbers of Jews to public office. And even in 1876, on the centennial of the United States, he even went to a synagogue, a brand new synagogue in Washington, D.C., Adas Israel Synagogue, and he sat there for all 3 hours of its dedication ceremony. And let me tell you, synagogue services go on for a long time. And he made it a large donation. I think he gave maybe $10, probably $200 in today's money. So he made amends for what he had done. And ultimately, the Jews in the United States recognized that he was making amends. Anti-Semitism rises after the Civil War. One historian calls it the development of a full-fledged anti-Semitic society. He talks about the period from the end of the Civil War to 1900. And I agree with him. Anti-Semitism develops in moments of crisis. And just think of the crises in the wake of the Civil War. The South is in rubble. The newly freed men and women are trying to figure out their place in the nation. The Ku Klux Klan is rising to push back against the development of their new positions. The world has changed dramatically. And then in 1873, there's a panic, an economic panic that was so severe that for the next half century, it was called the Great Depression. So in this moment of crisis, we see anti-Semitism rising, and first it's hitting the Jews who had come to America before the Civil War, the well-to-do Jews, the Jews who are acculturated. They think they're just like their neighbors, but then they see about them the way in which they are marked out as Jews. Those McGuffey readers are still being used in school. They're being taught that the triumphs of the world, those triumphs are the result of Christianity. when on Easter, around Easter time, when their teachers are reading the Bible before school, it's part of school every morning. What are they learning about? They're learning about how the Jews crucified Jesus. And we have records where we have people who tell us that for the next week they'd be beaten up on the playground. So anti-Semitism is there, and it's attacking not only the American Jews, who are acculturated, and of course the most famous example is the exclusion of the banker Joseph Seligman from the Grand Union Hotel in New York in 1877. But this is also the moment when East European Jews are beginning to come into America. They're fleeing poverty. After 1881, they're fleeing violent pogroms. And by the 1890s, we have calls to restrict immigration. We have the establishment of the Immigration Restriction League, and they want to restrict immigration to favor Nordics coming from Northern Europe and Central Europe, and make sure that Jews coming from Russia and Italians coming from Italy are not going to come in because those immigrants are undesirable. Jews coming from Eastern Europe and Italians coming from Italy, they're increasingly seen as undesirable because new ideas about race, about the construction of race, have come into America. Those ideas originated in Europe in the middle of the 19th century. By 1879, we have a new term coined, anti-Semitism, to express the dislike of Jews as a distinctive racial group, as a part of what the falsity of a Semitic group. There is no real people known as the Semites, and that there's accepted in the United States the ideas of a racial hierarchy that says Nordics, Aryans are superior, and all other peoples are inferior. It's definitely more detailed than black versus white. Also remember, Jews in the 19th century are not seen as white. They have an in-between status. They have a perception that they are racially other, and that the Jewish people constitute a race. We know how that ended in Europe. But the racial identity in seeing Jews as a racially distinctive group in the United States continues to persist down till today. Race and religion are bound up together. If we were to be fully accurate, we would not use the term anti-Semitism before 1879. We would be talking about anti-Judaism. We would be talking about Jew hatred. We would talk about Judeophobia. Those are the words that are the right words to use for this hatred of the Jews earlier. And in anti-Judaism, dislike of the Jews is initially predicated on religious dislike, on religious animosity. But from the get-go, it is incorporated with this broader sense that to be a Jew is not just somebody who believes in a different religion. It's actually the essence of this people, something distinctively different. Horrifically, Leo Frank gets caught up in all of this because when he is arrested in 1913 and charged with the murder of one of his workers and then sentenced to die as a result of a trial that was really a circus, Leo Frank was seen, on the one hand, he was seen as an outsider. He was a northerner. He was educated. He came down to the South. What was he doing? He was a manager of a pencil factory. He was exploiting Southern womanhood. He was exploiting these little girls who were putting erasers on pencils for pennies an hour. On the other hand, he was also seen as a Jew. And I really believe that in the South in 1913, only a Jew could have been convicted on the testimony of an African American, because it was the janitor at the factory, Jim Conley, an African American and ex-convict, whose testimony was decisive in convicting Frank. What's so striking about the Frank trial is I found a letter that his mother wrote to the Washington Post. And she understands that Leo Frank's trial, and I think American Jews understood this, was part of a series of trials around the world attacking the Jews, because she specifically referred in her letter to the Dreyfus trial in France, the trial of a military captain who was a Jew, who was convicted of espionage and sentenced to life imprisonment in solitary confinement on Devil's Island off the coast of South America. And Dreyfus was ultimately exonerated after the famous French writer Émile Zola issued a cry where he said, "I accuse," and he accused all the people involved in the cover-up that had led to Dreyfus's conviction. And in her letter, she actually wrote, "Where is the American Zola who will bring justice for my son?" The Jewish community was horrified by the Frank lynching, was horrified, frankly, by the trial. And it reacted in different ways. One source actually claims that half the Jews in Georgia fled in the wake of the Frank trial. Another reaction was the founding of the historic Jewish organization, Jewish Communal Self-Defense Organization, the Anti-Defamation League, which continues to fight against anti-Semitism down until today. But you also have to remember that Northern Jews were interceding with Frank, and not only in the initial trial, but they kept trying to help him with appeals, help him get his case heard at the Supreme Court, and of course that never happened. What's so striking about the aftermath of the Leo Frank trial is the way his lynching and the trial in which anti-Semitism figured is the way it hung over Southern Jews. And I'll give you an example from the diary of a woman that I once read, and she was from Atlanta. She moved to Florida, and years after Leo Frank's lynching, she wrote in her diary, "Today is the anniversary of his death." That here is this woman, she was a young woman when it happened in Atlanta, and yet she carried that memory with her. And I do believe that Jews, especially in the South, continued to carry that memory with them of that on American soil, this horror could happen. Remember, Leo Frank was taken from the jail without a single shot being fired. This is such a depressing question, because if you would have asked me where is anti-Semitism today a decade ago, I would have said it's in Europe. Anti-Semitism since the 2016 election has found purchase in the United States in so many different places that it is honestly impossible to keep up with it. So we have white nationalists in Charlottesville, Virginia, in August 2017 marching and chanting, "Jews will not replace us." We have the shootings of Jews at worship in their synagogues at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh and in Poway, California. And we have murders of Jews at a kosher supermarket in Jersey City. But I don't want us to think that anti-Semitism only figures on the right, because anti-Semitism today also finds that in many, many progressive spaces, including on my very own campus, Jews who support the existence of the State of Israel find themselves excluded from organizations that are interested in women's rights, LGBTQ rights, and environmentalism. So anti-Semitism is a factor that today hits American Jews from the right and the left. Today, American Jews learn that once again, we must live with anti-Semitism. The United States guarantees us the ability to exercise our religion. That said, there's intimidation about being publicly seen as a Jew. I know some Jews who, in the wake of the murders in the synagogue, who have proudly worn a Jewish symbol on a T-shirt or on a piece of jewelry. But I also know that it is dangerous to be seen as a Jew on the streets of New York City today, and that it has even curbed my own behavior. I'll be very careful not to carry a bag, one of those bags you get from some kind of organization. I don't want to carry that bag if it's got some kind of Jewish symbol on it or a Jewish name on it. Does that prohibit my free exercise of religion? No, but it does prohibit my ability to feel safe everywhere displaying that religion. To me, it means the ability to worship, to have public worship in the United States. Remember, in the early days, many groups, including the Jews, they were allowed to worship in private behind closed doors, but not to build their own buildings. Free exercise means that the United States does not prohibit one's ability in any way, shape, or form legally to practice their faith. Well, first of all, those polls are talking about the group that we like to call the nuns, right? They're the nuns. They say they have no religion. But it doesn't mean that they're not necessarily spiritual. It's that they don't affiliate with what we think of as an established church or an established religion. So often, what I've seen in the literature on that is that often the people who are the nuns they do have spiritual practices, and I don't think that they would necessarily say that we should not have free exercise of religion in the United States. I've never heard them make that claim in any way, shape, or form. They're just not personally interested in established churches for themselves. The striking thing is the Constitution actually says almost nothing about religion. It just simply has the original Constitution, not the amendments. It just has one clause that prohibits any kind of religious test for holding public office. I see free exercise of religion as one of the great triumphs of the United States after the Constitution was established. I think this is one of our most important rights that we hold as citizens, including the right to say you have no religion.